Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to today's session, The Evolving Legal Landscape of LGBTQ plus Rights. My name is Miranda Sullivan, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Coordinator at Equal Justice Works. We're so grateful that you are able to join us today. If you would like to enable closed captioning, you can do so by selecting the closed captioning option at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions or comments for our panelists during this session, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and our panelists will do their best to answer as much as they can toward the end of the session. As a reminder, this panel will run from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. This session will be recorded, and a recording link will be available tomorrow morning on the Grad Leaders platform. So, without further ado, I'm pleased to hand it over to our moderator, Milo.
Hi, so excited to have everyone with us today. My name is Milo Inglehart. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm a staff attorney at the Transgender Law Center. I think I'll just have the panelists briefly introduce themselves. They don't have to run through their whole resumes or anything because we're just trying to have a good conversation. Maybe we can just start off alphabetically with Alexander.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Chen. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the founding director of the LGBTQ plus Advocacy Clinic, which is at Harvard Law School. And I also teach gender identity, sexual orientation, and the law at the law school.
My next, I forgot the alphabet. Hi, everyone. Gabriella, Larios, she, her pronouns. I am a 2020 Equal Justice Works Fellow at the New York Civil Liberties Union. That's the New York affiliate of the ACLU. And I will be transitioning into a staff attorney position at the NYCLU come October. So wrapping up my EJW term. Kel, pass it over to you.
Hey y'all, my name is Kel O'Hara. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a staff attorney at Equal Rights Advocates. I started at ERA as an EJW fellow in 2019 and pivoted into my role after that. And my focus is Title IX and education equity, specifically for sexual assault survivors and LGBTQ students.
Awesome. So just to kick us off, it would be great to hear about your EJW projects, just because we're lucky that all three of you are fellows. Just what the topic was, I guess Kel already told us, but for the rest of folks, where your organization was, why you picked the topic. Yeah, just an overview.
Gabriella, you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first since I'm currently in my EJW term. So my project was engaging in advocacy, public education, outreach, litigation to challenge the use of religion to discriminate against people seeking reproductive health care and LGBTQ New Yorkers. So I had two primary topic areas for my fellowship: reproductive health and LGBTQ rights and work. So this project was like started working on coming up with the topic back in 2019. So this was around the time of Masterpiece Cake Shop, the Trump administration passing, trying to do a whole bunch of carve-outs for religious refusals, an increase in religious hospital mergers. Yeah, that was the climate at the time that this project was conceived of, and the focus of my project was really narrowed down to how hospital mergers are affecting healthcare for queer people, for people seeking reproductive healthcare, for all kinds of people. Usually religious hospitals are subject to ethical and religious directives, which prohibit things like contraception, gender affirming care, a whole range of things. So that was the really narrow focus of my project. In reality, I've worked on a whole bunch of things relating to the use of religion to discriminate, both against LGBTQ people and in reproductive health care. So one of the things that I've done a lot of throughout my fellowship is amicus briefs, especially in cases involving religious wedding photographers who are trying to deny services to same-sex couples. So currently, we submitted an amicus brief there, and that case is at the Second Circuit right now. Carpenter v. James. There's oral argument in it next week, actually. And I have also worked on a wider range of trans rights cases as part of my fellowship. So we sued the Broome County Jail in New York on behalf of a trans woman who was mistreated and abused there. We also sued the state of New York for not having ex-gender markers available in the state benefits agency. So I've done a whole bunch of different kinds of LGBTQ related work that are related to my fellowship project, but a little bit outside the scope of it as well. I'll pass it on, and I can keep talking about my host organization and everything later. Kel, I don't know if you want to go next.
Sure. So my EGW project was specifically about expanding representation and support for LGBTQ survivors of sexual violence under Title IX. So my background, I've done sexual assault, Title IX activism for about a decade now, and came into law school knowing that I wanted to work with survivors, and also that I was increasingly getting involved in queer advocacy, and throughout a through line throughout my Title IX activism was that the people around me were queer and trans, and that they're really shaping the work that I was doing. So by the time I got to the point where I was proposing an EJW fellowship, I thought I really want to combine these. And so that ended up being a little bit easier said than done. I was finding that a lot of organizations weren't really sure where my idea would fit with their existing programs. And so rather than ending up at sort of an LGBTQ specific organization, which is what I previously considered, I ended up at more of a traditional women's rights organization for the Title IX side of it. So I was doing a couple different things, a lot of direct services, so representing students in administrative proceedings, a lot of education and technical assistance, both trying to get schools and school districts to either change their policies or change how they're implementing their policies, understand how LGBTQ implicit bias, discrimination was factoring into the way they were handling sexual misconduct. So for example, a lot of my clients had experiences that were minimized or dismissed because they were in same-sex relationships. So how do we get schools to understand that that's something that they need to take seriously? Also working with attorneys and other service providers to identify Title IX issues within the LGBTQ community, know how to make appropriate referrals, know how to talk to the students about those issues. And then some litigation and some sort of related policy work and community outreach. So that work has changed over time in a couple different ways. Right after I came up with my EJW proposal, the Title IX regulations we found out were going to change. So the proposed regulations came down and all of a sudden there was a big fire around these really harmful regulations. So a lot of my fellowship was spent focusing on sort of that damage control. And now that we are in sort of shifting political landscape around how LGBTQ issues are showing up in schools, a lot of my work is pivoting towards there. So, sexual harassment, sexual violence is still something I spend a lot of time doing and focusing on, but increasingly expanding into other areas of LGBTQ discrimination in schools that are really prominent right now. I've started expanding more into litigation and impact instead of just direct services. I'm really in a moment of figuring out, what does this look like now? So it was great to have that EJW fellowship as the basis for, launching off and figuring out what comes next. And I was really grateful to have a team and sponsors that allowed me some of that flexibility as the issues were changing to say, actually, this is what needs to happen right now. And they really let me do that. Alex?
Yeah, so I was awarded an Equal Justice Works Fellowship to work for 2 years at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, which is one of the country's leading LGBTQ plus impact litigation organizations. The project that I was awarded the fellowship for was to advance the rights of transgender youth. At the time that I made that application, trans youth issues were really not in the clique light of the national discourse the way that they are now, but I saw that they likely would end up there because, trans youth are so vulnerable and there were so many things that they needed. And there was a growing interest in advocacy around making sure that trans youth got the things that they needed. But at the same time, it was really palpable, even in the process of seeking funding for the fellowship, that people were really uncomfortable with the idea that there were transgender youth and that transgender youth ought to be affirmed in their identities. And so while I was at NCLR, my project had like 3 different components. It had like a litigation component, a policy component, and a public education component. So taking those in reverse order, like for the public education component, I ended up writing a resource guide called the Trans Youth Handbook, which really focused on like trying to give trans kids like an overview of what the rights were in different areas, that I ended up publishing, at the end of my fellowship. And then I also, for the policy component, worked with our youth policy team. I helped to co-write a bill that made California the first state in the country where there is a statutory right to gender affirming care for trans kids who are in foster care. And so that was a really an amazing and educational experience in learning about state legislative work and the kind of coalition building you have to do. And, like the importance of thinking about enforcement as well. Like you can pass a lot of laws, especially in a place like California that loves to pass bills, but really under enforces them. And so learning a lot about thinking through how to make sure that even if you say you accomplish something like passing a law, that law is actually going to be effectuated by the agencies in question that are in charge of enforcing it. And then there was a litigation component of my project where I litigated some cases involving trans rights. And actually, one of them did involve a youth. It was a case that NCL already had that I was able to contribute to, involving Kyler Prescott, who was a trans kid in San Diego who very sadly died by suicide after being really horribly treated while he was being held on an involuntary mental health hold by a children's hospital in the area that he had been receiving gender affirming care from. But unfortunately, even though he was receiving gender affirming care from another unit, when he was institutionalized, he was repeatedly misgendered and dead named by another unit of the same hospital. And so that was a lawsuit about discrimination under the Affordable Care Act in 2015, which was like right after its passage. And it helped to sort of establish the proposition that for the purposes of the Affordable Care Act, attacks on transgender people are discrimination. And then I ended up also it wasn't really about trans youth, like facts wise, but legally was related to trans youth rights. Ended up litigating a number of other cases involving trans rights, including some of the transgender military ban cases, and also a landmark transgender prisoner surgery access case in the 9th Circuit called Edmo v. Corizon.
Awesome. It sounds like you all did some amazing work in your fellowships. Alex, you mentioned just some difficulties with sort of discussing like the transgender youth issue before it came into sort of the unfortunate spotlight that it's in now. And Callie, you mentioned that there was sort of confusion about where to like put your project, given that it crossed so many issues. So I was just curious, what were some of the challenges with doing like a project that dealt with LGBTQ rights for all of you?
I guess I can start this one. So at the point where I was proposing my project, there were sort of, as I saw it, there were 2 areas that I worked in and 2 areas that I was looking at for a host organization. One was organizations that focused on Title IX. Most of those were, gender justice organizations, had more of a focus on women and girls. And the other was LGBTQ organizations. A handful of them did Title IX, but usually in the context of facility access and things like that. So when I was talking to organizations, I was finding a sense on both sides that violence against LGBTQ students was not a top priority in terms of something they really wanted to lift up as an EJW fellowship. I have a lot of theories about why that is. I think some of it was just understanding the scope of the issue. So I remember I approached one nonprofit that worked with LGBTQ individuals and said, here's what I'm looking to do. And they said, oh, well, we don't really see anyone. We don't really get anyone in our organization that does experienced sexual violence or domestic violence. And at this point I had said, maybe I don't need to do Title IX, maybe I just want to do anti-violence work for LGBTQ folks. And so they told me, oh, it's not really something we see in our client base. And I said, is that something you screen for? Like, is that something you would know? And they were like, oh no, well, we don't screen for it, but we just know it's not a problem. And just based on the stats, that isn't true, right? And so I was finding this sort of resistance. And so what ended up ultimately happening was that I was going to law school in the Bay Area. There was an organization here, Equal Rights Advocates, where I now work, that folks that I was working with had suggested I talk to them about the Title IX work I was interested in doing. And it turned out that as I was starting to have those conversations and connect with those people, they were looking for a Title IX fellow. So they had different organizations do this in different ways. Some will say, here's the kind of project we want to do, apply and tell us why you're a good fit. Some will say, if you have an idea for a project, come and pitch it to us. And so I took their proposal of this Title IX project and I said, I really like the elements you have here, but I want to do an LGBTQ specific project. And we had found out typically EJW will say, here are some of the issues that are a top priority in the country right now or in your geographical area. And so I knew that LGBTQ issues were getting increasing attention. And so I was able to take that to ERA and say, hey, EJW has announced that this is a funding priority this year. And I really think that this is a crossover that's unique. It's one that I can do really well. Here's why. And they were the first organization to be like, yeah, I see what you're saying and I see what you're doing. I think that what has been, and this is expanding the scope of the question a little bit, what has been interesting since then is continuing to be in a space and figuring out still where my work fits, especially as I'm doing more LGBTQ work full-time in my career. It's not just a fellowship. The question for me has become, is this the best organization to do this? Do we want an LGBTQ specific project at this organization? Is that allowing the work to be led by LGBTQ specific orgs? Is that stepping on toes? Am I most impactful here where I can sort of bridge that gap between women's rights, gender justice orgs and LGBTQ orgs? And I think that's still a question for me, and one that I feel like different about all the time. But I'm really grateful that I started at that organization because I think it gave me a really different perspective than I would have gotten elsewhere. And it's allowed me to step into this space that just really didn't have the foundation that I wanted it to, and built that out a little bit more. But definitely just in terms of finding a host org, it was challenging. I think once I got past that point, once I actually started pitching and getting through the sponsor round, people were receptive. I was able to frame things in a way that was compelling and made sense, but definitely in a way where I really had to be conscious about that. I really had to think very carefully about my narrative. And I was a couple years after Alex. So people were starting to think about this as an issue. The rights of queer kids and trans kids was increasingly on people's radar, not in the way it is now still. But a lot of my fellowship, I think, was enabled by, it just so happened that the things that I was proposing were, as I was proposing them or right after I proposed them, all of a sudden became big, hit big crisis points. So I have joked at various points that my fellowship only really worked because things were so bad, which is not a position we want to be in as advocates, but ultimately I think helped get my project off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'll add is maybe two things. One is that, the reality is that one of the things that's good about doing a fellowship like this, or even applying for a fellowship like this, is that you learn more about the back end of how our nonprofit industrial complex works and how priorities are chosen. And sometimes people might think, well, I don't have to worry about that. If I just go and become a staff attorney at an organization, then I won't have to go through this process of selling what I'm doing to donors and all of that. But the reality is, if you're not doing it, somebody at your organization is doing it. And what they're saying and what they're doing and how they're getting the money, at least indirectly, will end up impacting what you do too. And so I don't think it's actually the worst thing in the world to learn more about how all that even works and how priorities are decided, because the reality is that a lot of these processes you'll experience in trying to figure out how to get your project funded are going to be the same kinds of dynamics that the organizations that you want to work for are also thinking through. And so, in a way, I think it was startling and kind of difficult. I really didn't appreciate finding out that somehow I was supposed to explain why it was more important to help trans youth than to help homeless people or to help, people who are sex workers, right? I think this kind of way in which it kind of, you're supposed to explain implicitly why you should be funded rather than somebody else. I think I really disliked that. And I really disliked, this way in which it was really focused in my mind on like really like, emphasizing people's suffering in a way to sort of pull at people's heartstrings. But I do think that, over time, I've come to appreciate that actually it gave me a much more mature understanding of the reality of the industry that I was trying to enter by becoming a civil rights advocate. And I learned a lot from doing that. And I learned a lot about what I personally am comfortable with, like what I personally am willing to say or not say in order to get a source of support, and how much play there is in the joints between what you say you're going to do and then what you end up doing, which can change also because, as both of you two have also mentioned, like facts on the ground can change. And that is also a reality. And so I think it's quite an educational experience and quite a valuable one.
Gabriella, do you have anything else you'd like to add to the conversation? Or
I will just say that I had a bit of a different experience in coming up with the project proposal and like applying and getting a host organization because I had been interning at my host organization when I applied for them to be my host organization. So it was a really collaborative process, and they had already identified the use of religion to discriminate as one of their strategic priorities. So I didn't feel like I had to come in as a third year law student and come up with something like new and innovative and like be alone in that. So I felt really supported, both because I was at an organization that had already identified this as a strategic priority, and like I was part of the larger ASCIL-U world where like other affiliates had been doing similar kinds of work. And my job was to like bring this to New York specifically and be able to identify facts and do some like factual investigation and really figure out what the problem in New York is. So my project was a bit of like a investigation and also responding to emerging needs. And I don't feel like I experienced like significant barriers to explaining what the problem was or getting people to understand it because of the political climate we were in at the time and like all the press that cases like Masterpiece Cake Shop had gotten. So I don't think I experienced significant barriers to getting funding for this project.
I just want to add one quick thing that I think explains a lot of this. So when I was proposing, I was coming up with my proposal in 2018. And something that was really emphasized was have statistics, show the problem, be able to talk about what the issue is. The only data we had that really captured the issues facing trans folks in particular was this one 2015 like national trans survey. And so part of, and I say this because Alex sort of touched on this too, is that depending where you are in proposing an issue and identifying an issue, sometimes you have to say, I can't tell you what's happening here from a like data perspective because people haven't cared enough to study it. And so how do you sell that? How do you market that? And it gets tricky. So it gets tricky when they're just really, I think, two different approaches when it's something that's already been identified and people are starting to be invested, rather when you're trying to pitch something that is not quite in the public awareness yet or is not as fully in the public awareness as we would want it to be.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And just like that lack of data really does make it so much harder when, like Alex, you're pitching and they're saying, why, are you not focusing on like unhoused people or sex workers, when it's like, oh yeah, also like young trans people sometimes are unhoused or sometimes are sex workers. And it's not like these are in fact distinct issues. But anyway, I guess sort of going along with that and going along with like the idea of having to, I guess not like prove the importance of your issue, but sort of how it fits into like maybe an organization's mission. I was curious for all of you, for the folks that did end up at like Alex, sort of an LGBT organization, for folks that didn't, what that process was like of sort of fitting into the organization's agenda, how you decided on your organization if you weren't already interning at it. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk briefly about that. So I did not intern at NCLR. The way I ended up there was really a little bit by happenstance. I had been invited shortly after I graduated. I clerked for 2 years, so I didn't apply for an Equal Justice Workers Fellowship until a year and a half after I graduated from law school, and I had been invited to address "quote unquote" the trans agenda for the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander annual conference. And when I was there, I met Kathy Sakamura, who's now the ED at the Legal Services for Children, but at the time was the deputy director at NCLR, and Ming Wong, who's a supervising healthline attorney. And maybe it sounds a little funny to say it, but I'll just say it. Like, I was just so excited that there were two non-white Asian people who worked at the same LGBT organization, because I had interned at various LGBT organizations where I was like the only non-white person on staff. And it really, I felt that it impacted what things they thought were important to work on within our community and not work on. And so I was really just excited about that. And it made me go think, wow, I want to learn more about an organization where there are multiple people of color and some of them are in leadership. And what do they do? And so that really led me to, I had already heard about NCLR and some of the work they'd done because, they had been sort of really out in front on working on trans youth issues before some of the other organizations. And they had kind of been involved in that, they had more history on that. They had incubated and then spun off the Transgender Law Center. And so I think, it was a little bit of an organic personal connection, and then having conversations with folks who work there and learning more about what they were thinking. And then, we did work collaboratively to come up with something that, they wanted to have more resources on, didn't have as much funding for, and that I felt like was important. It was a very organic process. And so they did not have an application process for fellows, and they in fact don't normally take them. It was really serendipity.
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit, but I guess I can expand a bit. So my first supervisor is Brenda Starr Adams. She is now at National Center for Youth Law, but was doing Title IX litigation at ERA when I was proposing, and was the person who's scheduled to be the supervisor. And it just so happens that she has queer moms, and we just are very similar people. The way that we think and move through the world is very similar. And so I had already been told that I should connect with her. Someone was like, she made this move to ERA. I think you would love her. I think she'd be a great person for you to talk to. And this was never explicitly told to me, but I could just tell from the get-go that like this was my cheerleader, that this was someone who really saw me, who believed in what I was doing, understood how it didn't fully fit in to the sort of organizational missions we were seeing, and had my back in all of that. So I was very, very lucky in that sense. In terms of how it's fit in with the organization overall, I think that there has both been organizational support for what I'm trying to do, and I think, as is inevitable in nonprofits, sort of ongoing questions about, am I the one actually leading that work? When and how is that work supported? And, do I actually have the resources that I need to do this work well? Is there an organizational understanding of these issues and what needs to happen to do this work well? And we have seen a lot more people applying and coming in who are invested in LGBTQ issues, but at the beginning of my fellowship, I was sort of the one, right? So everything got sort of sent to me if it was about queer and trans stuff. And I knew that going in. I knew that going in. I accepted that going in. I, at the time, was the only non-binary person in the organization or trans person in that organization, and was like, okay, I might get misgendered. I might have to explain this part of myself. And it turns out that other colleagues were really good about getting everyone on board and correcting people. They did trainings before I came just to make sure that everyone was on the same page about sort of how they should be treating me. But I'm still in spaces where a lack of understanding about trans and non-binary issues is not unheard of. And we've hit issues where, especially being in Title IX, one of the big Title IX issues right now is trans inclusion in sports. And people that my organization has worked with for years are now coming out with these really transphobic positions. And what do you do, right? And so, and what power do I have as a, now third-year attorney to say, whoa, we can't associate with those people. I've been really lucky in that my org has said, yes, absolutely. Like, of course, we have to deal with this. But that's not everyone. And I didn't have a guarantee of that coming in, right? So it's been, I think, complicated in those ways. But ultimately, because I knew what I was opting into and made an affirmative choice. I'm very aware of how I present. I'm very aware of sort of the code switching I can do in women's spaces and queer spaces. That was something I chose to use and to take advantage of, and to do for my clients and to do for this work. And I think that that just goes back to understanding that the dynamics you're walking into, right? Understanding how funding works, understanding, if I can sell this in a way that the existing donors or supporters of this space find appealing or palatable, then I can move this forward, as opposed to, if I try to push them too far. And that can be very personally challenging at times, and frustrating at times. And so far in my career, that's how I've gotten where I am. So I think that, one piece of advice I would have for anyone considering this work is just understanding those dynamics. I think is partially understanding what you can tolerate, and what you feel okay with, and what pieces of yourself you want to put out there, and engage with, what kind of work you're willing to do, and seeing if that is a sustainable career path for you.
Yeah, thank you both for those thoughts. And one thing that I really resonated with in both of that was like the importance of finding like really good mentors and like cheerleaders and people you connect with. So wishing that for all of our participants at wherever they go in their future. One thing that's come up a few times is sort of the changing landscape, both between like administration shifts, but also growing consciousness. So thinking about sort of where we are now compared to where we were or are when you started your fellowship. What do you think? What do you think are some of the challenges and opportunities in the field of LGBTQ rights law? And what would you sort of like to see as like a new area for work for fellowships or just in general?
Something that I feel like I've had to grapple with throughout the course of my fellowship is that litigation on my issues is just not an option these days. Like, the First Amendment is only becoming more weaponized. It's only being used to like further discrimination more and more and more. So like, we feel really stuck when people come to us and are like, what can we do about this situation that involves religion and LGBTQ issues? And like, we don't have clear-cut answers because all litigation feels risky. And I am at an organization that does a ton of impact litigation. So it feels like every single little decision that we make when it comes to litigation on my issues could end up at the Supreme Court and could end up like dismantling anti-discrimination laws. And it feels really big and scary to think about it that way. But I think that is kind of the reality that like has developed over the last couple of years now, I guess, especially when the Supreme Court was taking action on different COVID regulations and just like continuing to pit religion against public health and all of these other issues. And I don't really see an end to this. I think, conservatives are very well funded and like have so much legal power behind these efforts. Like, the Alliance Defending Freedom files amicus briefs in all of these cases all across the country and like are such a well-powered machine and have all these judges on the judiciary and all these Trump appointees and all of these things. So it feels like such a beast to overcome. And like, this is a conversation we're having every day and we don't know what the answer is. And we are trying to think of other advocacy opportunities and other policy solutions. But even with the policy solutions, it is like, is this constitutional? Will this end up being struck down by the Supreme Court? So I think it feels a little bit bleak, if I'm being honest right now, just given where the courts are right now and where it seems like it's going to continue moving. So I think in some ways I feel grateful that I am at an organization that takes such a multifaceted approach to advocacy, because we are really able to tap into our organizers and our youth ambassadors and our communications and public education like machine, and are able to like advance some of our issues without litigation. But when it comes to litigation, it like, that is what I came to law school thinking that I would spend all my time doing, and most of my fellowship hasn't actually involved litigation. It's involved working in coalition to stop a hospital merger in Schenectady, New York, and try and preserve comprehensive health care there. It's involved pushing policy solutions. So it feels like we're coming to a real reckoning point, and at some point we can't just keep saying this is too risky and we're gonna have to do something about it and like risk creating bad law, but people are getting hurt in the meantime and like, discrimination is happening. So it feels harder in some ways than it was when this project was first developed, which is super scary.
Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. I actually literally this morning just taught my class on Obergefell and Dobbs. And so I just had the students do this exercise where I had them kind of like play out being like basically an ACLU like organization and then an ADF like organization, like pros and cons on the major arguments to just like, and I was just really interested to see what they'd come up with, right? Because this is exactly what, you know, we've all been thinking about ever since the draft decision got leaked in Dobbs. And so, yes, certainly, I totally feel you, Gabriella, on kind of the national litigation landscape. And you know, we are litigating a lot of those types of cases as well, right? Including some with your organization on things like ID docs and, you know, medical restrictions and, you know, prison conditions and all of that kind of thing. You know, I think that, however, I will say this. I think that what is giving me life these days is the opportunity I feel like this moment creates to think more creatively about what we can be doing on behalf of our community and to be more expansive in what we're doing. So some of the things that our clinic is doing that I am the most excited about include, for example, that we co-founded a coalition called the Polyamory Legal Advocacy Coalition, and we've been working with municipalities around Massachusetts, and there are 3 of them that are the first 3 places in the country where more than 2 people can be domestically partnered with each other. And that is really interesting and novel and raises all sorts of complex like state municipal law questions, but also, you know, is about this like, well, we shouldn't be afraid that this is the worst fear of the dissents in these gay rights cases, right? It is like what would happen if more than 2 people wanted to be a family together and support each other and give health insurance to each other. It's very terrifying, right? But actually, you know, I think that when there's a backlash, there can be a feeling of like, oh, we have to conserve what we have. We have to hang on. We kind of have to like boulder down and like hunker down and like hang on to what we've got. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, was what we had before good enough? Did it serve our entire community? Did it help some people, but not others? Were we done when Obergefell was decided? And I would argue we weren't, right? We not just on things like transgender issues, but like issues that disproportionately affect people of color in our community, disproportionately affect people who are in rural areas, people who are in the South, kids who are getting subjected to conversion therapy, incarcerated people. There were so many continuing problems. We still could get fired for being LGBTQ plus and, you know, getting married at the time of Obergefell, and even post Bostock enforcement of that has been terrible, right? So actually there are so many different areas where we hadn't made a just enough society. And I think we have to think about what will mobilize and energize people in our community to continue to believe that our movements can do something to help them. Well, if we want to do that, then we can't just say, we just have to go back to where we were. We have to say, we see how none of this is serving anybody. And the way that we experience it as a community is at the intersections of all these other identity groups as well, right? And I think that's the kind of work that will give us the power building to be able to move forward. And actually another project that I'm excited about that's new this year is we have debuted something called the Queer Lands and Spaces Project. And we're working with organizations like the Larios Committee for Civil Rights to figure out how we can provide technical assistance to organizations that are doing things like trying to preserve historic gay beaches. Why aren't we doing things like that? Why aren't we thinking about where are the spaces that our community finds joy? Why are the spaces where our community finds community and finds connection and builds power? So I think we as lawyers actually have so many tools. And I don't know anything about transactional law or like how to make something a historic landmark or anything like that, but we can learn and try. And so I'm committed to the idea that we still have to backstop our existing civil rights situation. We can't just let them walk all over us. We do have to hold the line, but not every organization, not every person has to just be holding the line. And I think that we could be using more energy that's thinking affirmatively about creating the kind of world that we want to live in, that we don't live in yet.
I love that answer, Alex. And I think it goes to some of the things that I have been thinking about as well. So just for context, when I first started doing Title IX activism, this was the Obama era. Biden at the time was like really driving a big push around college sexual assault. And we had new guidance come out and it was like, wow, look at all this progress that's being made. And so when I went to law school, it was still like, oh, great, like things are looking pretty good. And what is the potential? My dream for Title IX has always been, how do we handle sexual misconduct in schools in a way that is about education and about giving people a chance to learn and shift and take advantage of that educational opportunity to create an understanding of how we want to treat each other and what's acceptable and what's not. And then we had the Trump administration, we had transgender guidance taken away, we had the regulations around, or the guidance around how schools should handle sexual misconduct taken away, and had these new rules put in place that just moved the whole thing closer to something resembling the criminal legal system without any of the protections of the criminal legal system. And that was awful, obviously, and beyond sort of the misunderstanding of my client base, you also had, with good reason, a lot of queer and trans folks, a lot of, I don't know what that is. Can everyone hear that?
I heard something, but I think we're good.
Great. We had a lot of queer and trans folks, who wanted an alternative that didn't feel punitive in these ways, right? And so what I have been looking at a lot is, how do we incorporate restorative justice into this process? How do we incorporate, a way of doing this that does not depend on these sort of like quasi-legal ways? And actually, the Trump guidance opened the door to that in ways that didn't exist before, because of concerns around mediation and mediation being used inappropriately. And so what I've been able to do and think about is, okay, when these opportunities are taken away, where can we expand into it? Where can we find things anyway? And how can we both put out the fires, but also think about sort of, what does everyone need? How do we think creatively here? And that has been challenging in a lot of ways. It's challenging to look at what is happening on a national level and say, where do we get involved? Do we get involved? Do I just stay in this lane and do it really well? And I think those are really important, big questions, but just because I don't think now is the time to go to the Supreme Court on a lot of these issues does not mean that there's nothing to be done. And I think for me, what I found over the course of my career is that anything that is hopeful, that is creative, that is forward thinking, that is really about being in community, building community, making community feel seen and held no matter what the larger system is telling us or doing, is so important. And I think that I don't see any way to be really involved in this kind of work right now without being able to hold on to that sort of sense that it is not hopeless.
Thank you so much for those like very thoughtful and beautiful and like inspiring words. As someone who does do this work, I'm feeling a lot better about it after hearing you like talk so expansively about our future. We should probably switch into the Q&A pretty soon. But just before we shift over to that, I was just wondering if you could give one piece of advice to, I guess, your young self, or maybe just younger law students in general, what you might want to share about this kind of work.
I think I am closest to law school, and I feel like I wish I could have gone back and told myself that it's okay to ask for help. And I feel like I still feel myself so resistant to asking for help. Just earlier this week, I was feeling sick, and I was like, I had to force myself to ask my colleagues to take on an extra call or lead something for me because I like was not physically up for it, and I wish that I like did not spend 2 years of this fellowship like trying to push myself and trying to do things, because like if I'm going to be in this work for a long time, I need to take care of myself. And there are like so many strong relationships I've built, not just at my organization, but outside of it as well. And like people are there to support you and want you to succeed. And part of that is like prioritizing yourself and your health and your like both physical and mental. And I think law school really, at least I felt it in law school, there was so much competition and division, and like everything felt so intense. And it doesn't necessarily need to be that way, because if you've built a community of people around you, they will be willing to support you and help you and like take pride in that. So I guess as an evolving lesson for myself is ask for help when you need it. You have people who love you and support you.
I guess mine would be not being afraid to advocate around the things I know in myself. So don't be afraid to be myself. So, you know, I am a lawyer who has a lot of tattoos and a mullet. And that is sometimes uncomfortable when I walk into a room with a lot of older white men who clearly think that I don't know what I'm talking about and am really young, and I can just tell that they don't respect me, right? But I'm really good at my job. And more than that, my clients, like the number of times I've gotten on a Zoom call with a client for the first time, and they're like a teenager or someone who's in their young 20s, and their eyes light up and they're like, oh my God, you are like a grown-up lawyer who looks like that. You're like a grown-up lawyer who acts like this. And that in and of itself is really powerful for me. And I think that allowing myself to be who I am has been really incredible. And that I think that extends to how I do my work too. So I'm very open about the fact that I'm very ADHD and have, just like other stuff going on with my brain. That means that operating in sort of the like very organized, very focused, very structured ways that we're expected to under capitalism and particularly in the law, it's just not how my brain works. And so rather than trying and failing to fit myself into those expectations, I've been able to say, here's what I can do incredibly well. Here's what I can crush every day. And here's what I need to be able to do that. And sometimes that looks like flexibility. Sometimes that looks like shifting my work hours so that I'm doing a ton in the evening and not as much in the morning. Sometimes that means asking for external accountability or structure that I know I can't build for myself, and not being afraid to ask for help in those ways. And that has just made it was very scary when I was starting my career to admit, like, hey, these things that I feel like are just expectations of this field are things that I struggle with, and would rather tell you what's up with me and what I need than wait to mess it up and have you and get in trouble, right? But it's been really liberating. Not to say it's always been easy, and not to say that I've always felt understood in those things, but holding on to my own sense that it's important and that I'm actually setting myself up to do my best work has been great. And I found that the more that I'm open about that and talk about that and embrace that, I found that particularly like with our law clerks that come in and other people I interact with, so many people are like, oh my God, I didn't know I could be honest about that. And I didn't know that I could ask for that. And I'm the same way. And this is really helpful. And so I think, it sounds cheesy to say that letting yourself be yourself in a work environment as much as you're able to is important and can be important. And obviously there are spaces and identities where that is harder and where those things are treated differently. But I think for me, to the extent that I've been able to, has been a really good thing.
I'm happy to answer this question, but Milo, I kind of also want to hear you answer the question after me, if that's okay. Just because I think your perspective would be great too. But I guess what I'll say is, I think the advice I would give myself has changed with time. I think what I would say to myself now is that it's really important for you to believe that you have a sense of self-worth in the world and you are worth something and you matter, even if you walk away from this job and this career, which is a really hard thing to do when you're also like working with might and main to make it. Right. But I think that what I didn't really understand when I was younger is that like this entire system, whether by design or accident, has the effects of making everybody feel like they are barely like hanging on by their fingernails to being able to make it in this career, both because you're so badly paid, but also because there are so few jobs, and also because everybody is like, it's kind of like the Devil Wears Prada when like, a Meryl Streep's character is like characters like 1 million girls would kill for this job or whatever. Or so, then you're supposed to like put up with, these very bad working conditions and this very bad level of pay and sort of feel like a very strong scarcity mentality. And all of that tends to cramp our ability to think more expansively and more optimistically and more creatively about what we do, right? Because everybody is like, we've got to hang on to what we have, and the organizations have this kind of feeling, and then the individual staffers have this kind of feeling. And the whole thing can be very, very corrosive. And so I think like you can be so focused on like, oh, I have to make it, that you don't even question, of course, should you make it? Who are you going to be by the time you made it? And what are you going to do in the world? And are you going to just do the same thing everybody else did? Are you going to become the kind of person that when you were more radical and younger, you thought they're just a part of the machine? How do people become part of the machine? And the machine does good work sometimes. But at the same time, you know, is it just that you yourself can be a cog in that machine? Or is there something else you're bringing to the table? And I think the only way that you can bring anything else to the table is by really believing that your identity and worth do not solely hinge upon having a particular kind of position, and being able to like see that you yourself have a sense of worth beyond that, and that you can walk away from it and you can contribute to society in other ways. So I think that is like the hardest thing, and it's not getting any easier, believe me. You know, now that I'm doing you and different things, and they all seem really exciting and cool, like it's even harder than it used to be. I didn't imagine it could be harder. It's harder every day to believe that I can walk away from this and still mean something. But I have to hang on to that, because otherwise I'm not going to matter, in the sense that then I'm not going to do things with a position that would be different than what somebody else would do. And then what was the point of me doing them or being in this position at all?
These are all really wonderful. Yeah, wish I had that advice when I was starting law school, from all three of you. For my own advice, I think it goes a bit along with what Alex was saying. Just like finding your community, both to like help you make it through this like sometimes very vicious, isolating, and sometimes also very like inspiring and wonderful and like community filled profession. Yeah, but really finding your community and figuring out like who you're accountable to in your work. And like who you're doing, yeah, like who you're ultimately accountable to. So I think, yeah, that's my advice. It looks like we have some awesome questions coming in. Let's see, I'll just check out some. Yeah, a couple ones are asking about legal issues coming down the pipeline. So just, we'll try to do these quick because I think we have like 6 minutes left. So lightning round legal issues that you are interested in or concerned about.
God, too many to list. A big thing that I'm looking at right now is sort of how anti-LGBTQ bills are affecting schools, forced outing to parents, things like that.
I would just say, you know, non-binary issues in general, like there's more non-binary people than there ever have been, you know, and a huge percentage of younger people are identifying as non-binary. The law has like almost, there's like no case law on it, and people have barely even begun to articulate how that is going to work. And you know, we're working with an organization called Beyond Binary Legal, which is the first a legal organization in the United States, as far as we're aware, that explicitly is by and for and about non-binary legal issues. And I think like, you know, that is an emerging issue that, you know, there's some space for positivity and as well as, you know, concern.
I think we're going to see a whole bunch of like interstate, like hostile state versus access state issues with the provision of gender affirming care to youth. So I think like I wish I could go back and pay more attention to all of those classes in law school to like actually be able to understand what the implications of so much of this is. And like we're also going to see like a greater understanding of like the family regulation system and how that plays into all of these things, including the provision of gender affirming care to youth.
Can I just say something real quick, which is I think sometimes this question is sort of like the implicit premise is we will give you ideas for your fellowship projects. And I would say that instead of doing that with what we're saying, I would suggest that people who are listening to this think about what are issues that they personally have lived experience or connection to, where they can be an advocate who brings more to the issue than simply like being like a brain in a jar, right? And so I think that's really where the most effective advocacy comes out of. So like where it's really tied to lived experience and to sort of a deeper knowledge of what is going on in a system. And so just like think about that more so, I think, than like more than like generalizably speaking, like what is the objectively most important issue you should be working on.
Yeah, I can say that when I got, they tell you this in the EJW process, I'm not revealing anything. when I got my funding, my sponsors told me, like, we are sponsoring you. Like, yes, we like your idea, but we are sponsoring you. We see that how much you care about this. We see we see the kind of ideas you have, and we believe that you will do what you're setting out to do. And so I've seen projects get funded where maybe they're not like the sexiest legal issue out there, but the person has such a clear narrative. They have such a clear sense of what they're doing and why they want to do it. And that does matter in fellowships. And I think it matters in your career, doing what I think what EJW really pushes is the idea that whatever work you're setting out to do should be something that really speaks to you and drives you, and is a passion, not just something that you feel like you should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we only have time for one more question, but I think this might be a good one to end on. The person asked for trans, non-binary people who want to get into advocating for members of their community, how can you protect against the very personal trauma you're exposed to every day at work? And like definitely applies for trans and non-binary people, like working at the Trans Law Center as a trans person, I know that. I think it also applies to like racist violence, misogynist violence, like all kinds of violence that this work brings us into contact with. So speaking to any of that, great.
So I think the thing I would say is we actually teach a seminar on session on this on vicarious trauma in our clinical seminar for our clinic, because it is something that is really important. And what I would suggest is don't look to lawyers for best practices on vicarious trauma. Actually, there's a lot of good literature about this in the fields of mental health, and doctors, especially, you know, who are more sort of like attuned to the medical literature, because there's actually a lot of techniques that you can learn from there that are more helpful than, you know, our profession has barely begun to grapple with the concept of vicarious trauma, because implicitly, like, a lot of our professional models are based on the idea that you're not a part of the community you're advocating for, which is just simply not the way that, you know, we think today about how we ought to be doing advocacy. And so, you know, look further afield than us, but there are tools out there, and you should just be aware that those might be tools that like your supervisors or organizations have no idea about, and that you may just have to decide how much you want to be educating them versus just using those tools for yourself.
Please read the book Trauma Stewardship. It's my go-to. I recommend it to everyone. Exactly what Alex is talking about. Cannot recommend it enough. I'd also say that, you know, I'm not going to say like self-care and this, that, and the other, because of course, knowing your limits and respecting your own limits. I know the issues that when I try to dive too far into them, just mess me up for days. And those lines for me are different than other people's lines. There are things that I do that other people can't touch that don't bother me at all. And I think that something that I really struggled with in law school was the sense of, especially as someone who went to a law school with a lot of people who wanted to be like radical lawyers, right? Was the sense of like, if you weren't doing the most intense, most heartbreaking, most devastating work, if you were in the middle of the fray, that you were somehow not, I say this somewhat facetiously, but not woke enough, right? And that a lot of that just didn't work for me. Like I knew that I couldn't, like, systems of incarceration just make me sick, like these other things, and I couldn't be helpful in that environment. It's not that I don't care, it's not that I don't think it's important, but I knew I couldn't be helpful. And so knowing your own limits, respecting your own limits, taking a step back when you need to, taking a step back and asking for help before you hit the point of complete burnout, knowing who your allies are within a space and within the wider community, having connections that are not at all connected to the legal field and are not stuck in this often very depressing world that we're in. All of these things that give you perspective allow you to zoom out, and not expecting yourself to be a version of yourself or a version of an advocate that can handle whatever life throws at you, because not all of us are like that.
Can I just say one more thing about that also, which is like, it's really important to think about, if that's something you care about, the work culture of wherever you might want to go. Listen to the way that the more senior attorneys talk. Do they joke about, you know, spending all night at the office and like spending weekends there? Do they kind of have that implicit expectation? That's what everyone needs to do. They got to put in their time. It's not going to be a good work environment if you know that you are not somebody who's going to be able to do that. And I also think that, you know, because of this model that I was talking about, where it's presumed that we're not a part of the community we're advocating for, we don't even price in the cost of vicarious trauma in terms terms of like how much healthcare people need and how much paid leave they need and how many hours they can be working. And so actually part of like how do you protect yourself is like recognizing that toll and accounting for that toll and the amount of time you dedicate to the work. But it's also like that's a collective process, and it's really hard for you to do that by yourself as a junior attorney if you don't have people around you who are going to support you in that, either like in your peer networks or at your organization. And so it's really something that's like worth thinking about.
I think we're at time, but I loved having this conversation with you all. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your thoughts. Yeah, and I don't know if there's any last closing stuff you want to do, Miranda or EJW.
Sure.
Close up.
Thank you. So thank you to our panel and for everyone for participating in today's session. We hope you enjoyed it and found it to be very educational, informative, and just helpful for your future careers and the decisions you make down the line. We also want to thank our event sponsor, Idealist, for helping to make this year's Equal Justice Works Conference and Career Fair possible. And if you have any questions about this year's event or want to know more about how Equal Justice Works can help you launch your public interest legal career, you can reach out to our event team at careerfair@equaljusticeworks.org. Thanks, everyone.